Okay. Kirsten, we good?
Very good.
All right. So, as you probably saw on here, I'm going to talk about iNaturalist. You've probably heard of this at least once in your life, but I'll do a quick overview. What is iNaturalist? It is a social network similar to Facebook, similar to MySpace. That just came to mind just now. Similar to Twitter. And this is how I think of iNaturalist because I use it a lot. It's a social network to record plant and animal observations, give and receive species confirmations, and confirm the same for others. One of the main things it does is it'll automatically ID and pretty much any species from just the photo using computer vision and AI, but that's not the only thing it does. It does a lot more. So I'm going to go over that. I'm going to try and go over that a lot tonight. So things I like a lot about iNaturalist and reasons why I use it a lot. It does give really quick and usually pretty accurate species suggestions and confirmations. It's especially good for really common species. It keeps a log of anything you submit to it with a date stamp and a place where you saw it and the photo. So it makes a really nice travel log, which I'll show an example of. For me personally, I don't work in botanical research or ecological research anymore. I work more in agriculture now. And so iNaturalist is one of my primary ways to keep my plant ID skills up, especially during the winter. You can go through and identify other people's observations. And, I don't lose that skill because use it or lose it, right? And finally, it's a great plant search engine. So similar to herbarium databases, it has millions of observations, more than just the Pacific Northwest. It has millions of observations all over the world. It's a beautiful plant search engine to search by time, place, family, any taxonomic level. So as a cool history of outings, so I've been using it for almost 10 years now. This is a map of all the observations that I've done in North America. It sort of aggregates them so that it shows fewer than there actually are. But for example, and for me, it's just really neat to see these and go and reminisce about various hikes or various cool plants that I saw. So for example, here's a hike I did in New Mexico, southern New Mexico. You can see every cool plant that I took a photo of and uploaded to this. One of them is this cool, what's it called again? Mexican starleaf orange. It's a very southern US plant, but very neat. Very cool to go back and remember those type of things. One of the other highlights of it is it's a great plant search engine. So you can ask, and kind of like Google, similar to Google, you can apply filters and ask questions like, what is the most popular Fabaceae that you see in Tucson in March? And here's a list of those. And so in this case, around Tucson, we see a lot of these nice shrubby Fabaceae. And I chose Tucson for a reason because I could have done this somewhere in Idaho, but we're all Idaho plant experts and it's all stuff you already know. And I just wanted to point out that this is a global database and you can run queries like this anywhere in the world to see what kind of plants that people are taking photos of. So it's really neat in that regard. And by the way, if you're really into the shrubby Fabaceae, southern Arizona is the place to be. It's amazing. See, another good example. What are the most popular plants to take photos of around Banff in midsummer? So some of these are probably a little more familiar to us. Fireweed, Castilleias, things like that. Very similar to what you might see in Sandpoint. So if you want new flora and you want to go to Canada, maybe go a little farther north or a little farther west to get into a different floristic region. I promise I'll get to Idaho plants in a moment, but just one more cool example. So I also asked it, what are the extreme extents of the saguaro cactus in Arizona? So this is a really, really iconic species, one of the most iconic ones in North America, one of the most recognizable species in North America. It's one of the few you can do a positive ID from your car. And so when I say, okay, what are the most extreme extents? I looked at the most western one, which we can see some over here, and the most eastern one, which are over here. And this is actually just two individual plants that this ended up being. And so it turns out these are kind of celebrities in the saguaro world. So this individual in Southern California, it's well outside the regular range of saguaros. It's outside Joshua Tree National Park, not in Joshua Tree National Park, but nearby. It's growing in these rock outcroppings, which probably keep it warm in the slightly cooler winters that this experiences. And it's literally the same individual that's probably near a trail that people take a photo of every time they pass. So saguaro is a really popular plant, and I just guarantee anyone with iNaturalist on their phone who sees a saguaro in a weird place like this is going to take a photo. And there's honestly there's a few dozen photos of this one individual. And these three are 10 years apart. You can actually see the growth in it going on. So it's just really interesting. And then there's a similar thing going on in the eastern end of this range. So if you drive from Arizona to New Mexico through through the range of saguaro, it's sort of really sudden. Like you see saguaro everywhere. It's sort of like, not quite like sagebrush or like, the abundance of Persia maybe. But then all of a sudden you cross over a hill and they're gone. There's just no more left. But there is one hanging out alone on a mountainside near Arizona, New Mexico border. That's near a road, so people see it. And you can see it's the exact same individual that different people take photos of every single year. And it might be the most eastern saguaro in the range. So that's just a really interesting anecdote from this. All right, so I promised everything from here on out is all Idaho. So what's it take to put an observation on iNaturalist? It is a phone application and it's pretty straightforward. Within the app, you just say, hey, I'm sitting in front of a plant. I want to take a photo. You tell it that. You snap a photo real quick. It gives right away. It gives you a quick suggestion. So in this case, I took a picture of this little monkey flower, and it recognizes right away that it is a monkey flower. But in this case, it wasn't quite sure on the species. So it's saying, I'm sorry, this is a little small, but this is saying we're pretty sure it's in this genus, the Erythranthium, and it might be one of these species, but we're not quite sure. So in this case, I chose just monkey flower. I didn't take it down to species. You can be vague like that. You can also be vague up to family if you're not sure about that. You can also be vague and say it's just a plant. I don't even know which family it is. Then once you have that, it tags the location from the GPS on your phone. It gives it a timestamp and it uploads it to the database. Then you're good to go. Once it's uploaded on the site, it's available for others to add their identifications to it. So here's an example of someone who uploaded a picture of a fireweed just a few weeks ago. And so someone uploaded it. You can see the date and time that it was done. So it's reasonable for a fireweed. And then when I'm logged in as this, I have the option to just really quick click agree. And say, yeah, I agree it's a fireweed. Or if I think it's something else, I can suggest any other plant species if given my opinion. So in this case,
do you need internet connection for it to work?
yes, you do. Online only.
But you can upload them after the fact. You don't have to do it live. You can do it after the fact.
Want the location?
Well, it depends if you've got location turned on your phone to begin with. It will.
Doesn't always work.
So if you're out in the backcountry and don't have internet, it'll still let you upload photos. It won't do the automatic identification, but it still grabs the GPS location. It still grabs a timestamp, and then it does the upload once you're back in Wi-Fi or cell reception.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Or something I do when I'm in the backcountry is I just ensure that location is turned on for my regular camera photo, and then I upload everything manually through the website, which is also possible. And it goes through a similar step where if you upload a photo, it says, do you think it's this? It might be this genus, might be this species, and it's a similar process.
Question.
Yeah, go
So
ahead.
am I understanding correctly, you can just take a photo with your regular phone camera, not through the app, and then later push it into the app?
Correct.
Okay.
You can do it with a regular computer.
Mhm.
Doesn't need
Oh,
your phone
that's
app.
sitting at your desk.
Yeah, that's probably the most of mine.
Yes, one more question.
If you also have your cell phone along and you have a GPS track log app, you can keep a log of where you were. And then there's apps available to match the time when you took the photo with the track log. So you can
Mhm.
get a GPS coordinates into your photos.
Yeah, so there's many options. Even if you're using an older camera that doesn't have a GPS in it, you can still upload those photos and choose the location manually. and give it some uncertainty, saying like, oh, I think I was around this part of the trail when I took this photo, and that's good enough. Any other questions? Cool. So for this particular one, I agree this was a fireweed, and all I did was click agree on that, and it added my identification to the bottom, and it made it its tagged what's called a research grade, which means it has 2/3 of the identifications match. In this case, 2 is enough, but if one person came in and disagreed and put some other identification, maybe not on fireweed, maybe on something else that's a little harder to identify, then this research grade tag goes away. So it's as many people as one, it could be dozens of people that are identifying them. As long as 2/3 of them agree on the same species, then that gets confirmed. And it also needs a valid location and time, which you could also dispute those. I've seen things where, it's obviously a picture of, say, a fireweed or some other common plant, and it's just way out of the range of where it actually grows. And on those, you can go through and say, hey, is this actually where it's located? To question that.
So you could set up a saguaro background in your room. And point the eye, take the photo and get the record north. Saguaro.
Potentially, but there's some diehard saguaro fans. I'm sure they would figure that out.
Now I got something to do over Christmas.
It's always good to have new hobbies.
I've gotten into quite lengthy discussions with people who challenge my identification, because you can have discussions about it and then you come to a consensus. So it's not just I believe this, I believe that.
Yes, good segue. So when you put something on the site, it's available indefinitely for others to confirm or modify the identifications on it. So for example, I took a photo of this little trifolium hiking out once. I did not know what species it was. I didn't feel like keying it out. So I just left it at trifolium. And that was 5 years ago. 3 years after that, someone came through and marked it as trifolium pinetorum, I think. And then 2 years later, just last week, I got a notification saying someone else confirmed it as the same species. And so now it has that research tag as trifolium pinetorum. And like I said, I've been using this app for about 10 years now. I have thousands of photos on here. I probably get one or two notifications every week of people still putting identifications on my observations. So it goes on pretty much forever. So on to Idaho. Where do people use this in Idaho? This is a heat map of all the Idaho plant observations. No surprise, people use it where they live. So the hotspots are in Boise, in Pocatello, a little bit in Moscow, a little bit in some of the other national parks and like good recreation areas, but it's primarily where people are already living that they take observations, that they submit observations with it. And then within Boise, it's mostly along the city parks, along the river, along the Greenbelt parks. This one is Catherine Alberson's park. This one is Hyatt Reserve Park. There's quite a few in the foothills. Does anyone know what these two hotspots are off the top of their heads?
No.
Oregon Trail.
No.
Southern Boise.
This is Timberline High School and Hawthorne Elementary School.
What are the very faint circles on the upper side of the river?
Over here? Looks like foothill spots. They might be trailheads going off the road that goes up there. Yeah, these schools being hotspots, I didn't notice until I made this map. But I suspect some of the teachers there encourage their kids to maybe to do class projects where they install the app, take pictures around the school. And it's very recent too. There's a bunch going on this year. It goes back a few years. So over time, iNaturalist has been around since 2012. It took a few years for it to really take off, but then it's been exponential growth since then. Currently, we're at this most recent year, we had over 50,000 plant observations in Idaho. And worth it to know, it's more, people do use it for more than use it for plants more than any other thing. More than insects, more than birds, more than all the other organisms in Idaho. It's mainly a plant app.
They stand still for you.
Yes. And I'll go over this a little bit more later, but it's basically what can you easily take a photo with your phone? And it's mostly plants. And it's not just the same people using it more and more every year. The amount of users increases every year as well. We're sort of moving down here in 2004, but I pulled this data set around 1 or 2 months ago. So there's still a little more time in 2024 for more users to sign up, which might or might not happen. And again, more users are using it for plants than any of the other major life forms. So how do people use it throughout the year? No surprise here. It's mostly plants. It's during the summer that plants have leaves, plants have flowers. They're worth taking a photo of. They're identifiable. And that's also when people are more out and about. Like people just don't go out in the winter, you know? So most plant observations happen in the summer. There's still a few that happen in the winter. Interesting anecdote here is bird observations stay the same more or less every month. So birders are going out no matter what, which I guess makes sense because with the migration, there are some birds that are only here a certain time of the year. So it's either you get out in the winter or you're not going to see them, right? See, and so Idaho, people on iNaturalist in Idaho are mostly looking at plants, and that's a little above average for all of the USA. So if you consider all of the United States, it's still majority plants, but just under 40%. We're just over 40%, and then a higher emphasis towards birds here in Idaho. And yeah, like I said, because it's mostly phones that people use this on, and it's hard to take photos of anything else except plants. But despite being mostly about plants, the #1 species pretty much everywhere in Idaho and the world are the ducks, the mallards. So the most common species are right here, top 5. We have 2 plants in the top 5, sagebrush and mullein. That's not bad. And then 3 common birds that we see all around town. In the rest of the USA, the top 20 or so is all birds and common insects. So like the monarch, the honeybee, the most common plant considering all the USA is poison ivy, 20-something. So yeah, people in Idaho really like, when using iNaturalist, you really like taking photos of plants, getting plant IDs more than anything else. See, so I'm going to show a lot of like insights and analysis just using the iNaturalist data, using like, the location, the time that was took, the species that we're doing. And so it's good to consider what motivates people to take photos of certain plants. And so I like to say, what does it take for a plant to get its photo taken? And it takes a few things. First of all, the plant has to be where the people are already. Notwithstanding everyone in this room, most people don't go out of their way to find a particular plant, right? It has to be already where on the road they're on or on the trail they're on, and be conveniently accessible. This is a map of all the observations around Pettit Lake up near Stanley. And you can see it follows the trail system there pretty much exactly. So they're only taking photos next to the trail. There's the occasional one that are off trail. And I guess, there's the occasional botanist that goes up there. But most people are not leaving the trail to take photos of plants. The second major thing is it has to be interesting somehow. The #1 thing that drives this is having nice, showy flowers that are interesting to look at. So yeah, the camas is a great example of that. Really interesting fruits work as well. One of the most photographed things here in Boise is the milkweed, and it's not just the flowers. There's a lot of observations of the fruit because it's a really interesting fruit to look at. And I'm sure I feel like it's similar to dandelions, where you see the dandelion fruit, and some people don't really associate it. It took me a while to do this, to associate with what it was before that. And it's probably similar to milkweed. Right? They're so different. People may not realize that they're the same plants. See, we can also be not necessarily interesting flowers or fruit, but just something really charismatic. So like this bristlecone pine sitting on a ridgeline, just like really pretty to look at. Things like that Things like that get a lot of photos as well. And then one final thing that I found that plants need to be, they need to be big enough for a camera phone. So a good example of this is Collinsia parviflora, which up in the foothills and especially around, the tree line and bogus, one of the most common plants technically, but it does not have a lot of observations on here. And that's probably because it's just so small. Where most of the time you might not even notice it unless you get down on your knees. And even then, it's really hard to get a photo of it. Just camera phones just aren't that good for that macro photography. So despite being really abundant, it's not really, Collinsia parviflora and other really, really tiny plants just aren't that well represented as they could be. So given all that, what are the most common plants around Boise? I split this out by month. So we can see, starting in January, where there are still plenty of photos being taken, is the evergreen plants, Russian olive and sagebrush, worth taking photos of. Also mullein, interestingly enough. And I thought about this, and I'm guessing it's just, the mullein that's decessed in the winter is still an interesting thing to look at. And people are still wondering what it might be. So it gets a lot of observation. It gets a lot of observations in the winter. And then as the spring and summer come on, the most common plants that are coming out that we see all the time are the same ones being photographed. So this is erodium, a really common weed that's coming out, one of the first ones in the spring. The little buttercup, I think it's sagebrush buttercup that made this list. Then Ribes aureum, that's the golden currant. It's one of the most common plants along the green belt. One of the first flowers to come out, and it's very much at eye level too. So it gets a lot of photographs. It's one of the most common ones for both March and April. And then balsam root, of course, maybe the most charismatic plants in the Boise foothills. So of course, gets tons of observations, tons of photographs of it. Erodium stays strong through the middle of the summer. And then the very common flowering plants that once summer comes by, Mariposa lily, the flowering Asclepias, the flowering milkweed, and also Yarrow draws a lot of interest. Going into the second part of the year, we have Asclepias still, chicory, also very common along the greenbelt. The other Mariposa lily, interesting enough, and also Grindelia, purple loosestrife. And then we get into those fall plants, usually weeds. Grindelia is not a weed, it's technically native. Annual sunflower. And then, the few fall flowering plants such as sagebrush again and rabbitbrush. One interesting thing that really stood out to me is dandelion is a really common right now this time of year, November, December. And this made sense to me because I was walking around just last week and I saw a dandelion flowering, which I think is not uncommon. And I feel like dandelion is, just a hint of warmth. It sort of shoots, goes for it and says, okay, let's try flowering right now. Just no fear. And so it's really one of the more common ones identified this time of year between November and December. So it's really good. iNaturalist is really good at capturing all the very common plants that we see all the time, that everyone sees all the time. But how is it with like the entire flora? So I downloaded the Consortium of Pacific Northwest Herbarium. I downloaded their database, which they make publicly available, and I cross-referenced everything, county by county. And iNaturalist represents about 50% of what's represented in the herbarium. So a little over half of all the species in Idaho are on iNaturalist. And that's at least one observation. So that's not bad. It's not perfect either, but it's pretty good for sort of a community science, very much volunteer effort, I also did my best to harmonize this data and sort of deal with all the name changes, which isn't perfect. So the 50% estimate is really an underestimate. And it's probably a little bit higher, maybe a little less than 5% higher, I would estimate. But still, it would be interesting to find out which species are definitely in Idaho, since we know there's collections of them, and are not on iNaturalist, and then I kind of want to go out and find them. Maybe the first one to have that Idaho species. So of the ones that are on there though, which, so 50%, there's no actual numbers on here. I think it was several thousand species. The ones that are represented can potentially be represented really well. So here's a good one from Northern Idaho, the Calypso, pink fairy slipper. I'm going to show a few of these maps. Blue is iNaturalist observations. Red is from that herbarium database. And for these really common charismatic species that get a lot of observations, the range overlaps between their true ranges are represented really well in the data. So like Calypso, it's mostly Northern Idaho, down to McCall, also over in West Yellowstone area. Really, just really nice spread of observations over its true range. The white Mariposa lily in the mountainous areas in central southern Idaho, down to the southeastern mountains, also really well matching of what the actual true range is, because it's a really nice one to take photo of, really easy to identify also as well. Bitterroot, not one of the more common plants in my experience, but remember, it's been around for 10 years. It's a really interesting plant. Someone with iNaturalist on their phone, I think, is definitely going to take a photo of this every single time, because it's kind of rare. For me, anyway, it's kind of rare that I see it. So I feel like other people out and about feel the same way. And so, yeah, so over 10 years of that happening, despite not having relatively many observations, it still gets represented really well to what the true range is in Idaho. And makes for a really nice record. In some cases, photographs end up being a better sort of way to look at the range than herbarium collections. So we do have a cactus here, the plains Opuntia polycantha. I think it's the plains cactus. Yeah. And it took me a moment to realize why there's so few herbarium collections for this. And I'm like, oh yeah, nobody wants to collect that, right? Only the hardcore botanists are going to collect this and make a herbarium sheet out of it. So I would say it's not an uncommon plant. I'm surprised I haven't seen it yet. It's wandering around like southeastern Idaho. I took a look at these observations around Boise. They are mostly in people's yards as a landscaping plant, but there is a handful in the foothills, so it does exist here. I also took a look at the ones along the Salmon River here, and all of these seem legit. So I think that's an actual true part of its range. And joined with the ones along the Snake, that sort of implies that it's going to be all along the Salmon River as well, right? No one's happened to take a photo of it in that part. But it sort of implies, I feel there's a pretty good chance that it exists all along there. The other major cactus we have here. So this is a rare plant. The herbarium database didn't actually give any coordinates. It only gave the counties that it exists in. But it's really common to get a photo of it on iNaturalist. There's plenty of observations well within the matching range. I think I've seen this once, walking around sort of a small peak in southern Idaho before I used iNaturalist though, but I would love to see it again. And then, yes.
You can get permission to see those coordinates from Consortium of Pacific Northwest Herbaria. You just have to ask for a login.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah, so you can actually get more detail than.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The flip side is here we're hiding it on the herbarium, but it's fully available to
Right.
iNaturalist. So we're not obscuring the data for a rare plant in Idaho like we're trying to do with the collections.
Mhm. So I don't have any examples here, but if a plant is listed as endangered, not necessarily rare, but endangered, they do obscure all the coordinates.
And you can, the person submitting the data can fudge the data intentionally.
Correct.
So.
Like I have a bunch of observations at my house and I don't want a hotspot on my house. So I obscure those. Let's see, one more where it's probably preferable just to take a photo instead of making collections is poison ivy. We can see it's really actually quite common, probably all along the Salmon River, especially where there is people. And it's not well represented in the herbarium databases. And I also checked, and it's not well represented on the NRCS plants database either. So this really needs to be updated with some more counties on here, because it's definitely everywhere in southern Idaho. And then one final one, Botricium multifidum, something moonwort. Krista?
Hmm?
What moonwort is this?
Cetridium,
Yeah,
I call
okay. So yeah, also not a super common plant, almost a rare plant, I think, though it's not on the list. But it also still really well matches the range of what it is. There is one observation down here on the border with Nevada as well. It's definitely Botricium. I didn't look hard enough to see if it was actually this species, but at the very least, it's a Botricium down there. So more on actual rare plants. I downloaded the list from the INPS website and did a quick cross-reference of all the S1 and S2 rare species. And of 336, 93 of them have at least one observation on iNaturalist. And when I say at least one, it's usually just one. So I have a few of the top ones right here, and it's only going down to 13. So I think about, of the 93, I think half just have one observation. I didn't take the time to go through and verify all those. Some of them might be misidentifications as well, but I was expecting a very small number, maybe a dozen. So this was actually really interesting to see a lot of rare plants well represented there. So I'll highlight a few of these. Southern Idaho onion was the number one on that list, really well represented. And if you think about the three things I talked about earlier, common along trails or roads, easy to photograph, charismatic. Southern Idaho onion kind of meets all of those because it's not the biggest plant, but it is right by a trail. It is has a very showy flower. And there's a few really nice populations all along the foothills on really popular trails. I've seen it out and about. I have some observations of it. And so it's on iNaturalist, it's the number one rare plant as far as number of observations go.
I think half of those are Barbara.
Yep.
It's just like that, for some reason, they decided to call it Southern Idaho onion when everybody here calls it. Aussies onion.
Okay.
And there is no European Aussies onion for it to get confused with. I don't know why.
And there is a good number of people that take photos of this as well. So 70 observations, 45 different people. And it's also very easy to ID as far as onions go.
I'm curious, how do they determine the common names? Is there a database they reference on iNav?
Yes, there is a large species, just like taxonomic database. I don't know which one. See, Christ paintbrush is another one that's really well represented on there. So this is only on someone on Mount Harrison down south of Burley. Again, this is a paintbrush, so it's a good size. It's a nice flower. It's also right next to a paved road. I figured out when I zoomed into this. So that's why it gets a lot of observations of it. And then, so one more by Sandabronia. Decent sized plant and looks like it has several populations throughout southern Idaho. So it is pretty well represented. Let's see. Yeah, no, also very pretty for a Brassicaceae too. So moving on to more insights. So looking at the range of stuff is one thing, but with so much data, with thousands of observations throughout the year, throughout the state, there's a lot of really insightful things we can pull from this data by doing some analysis. So let's start out with one of the most popular plants, arrowleaf balsam root. I looked at every observation of balsam root between Boise and this side of the Sawtooth, so that's a few thousand. And then with the GPS coordinates and a date stamp, I can look at the exact time of year that a photo was taken, and I can pull the elevation for it as well. And with balsam root, if you look at them, over 95% of them are of it in flower. So any observation, you can sort of assume like this is representative of the flowering phenology. And then when you plot that with the date on the x-axis, elevation on the y, you get a really beautiful phenology curve as the flowering moves up in elevation and throughout the state. And from here down in Boise up to the peaks of the Sawtooth. And then I can do a regression with this and put some numbers behind it and say, with balsam root, once it starts flowering here in Boise, then it's going to the flowering is going to move up about 1,000 feet every 2.5 weeks. That means once it starts flowering in Boise, about a month later, it's going to start flowering in Stack Rock, maybe a week or two later up at Bogus Basin, and then another month after that up on those high peaks where it grows up at 8,000 feet. So like Carrie mentioned, I did a lot of my PhD work was on phenology. So there's going to be a lot of phenology stuff going forward, just FYI. One of the other really common ones is Ribes aureum, golden currant. So this doesn't have a good elevation profile. It's mostly all along the river, along the green belt here in Boise. And so these are phenology curves for the past few years. Personally, I walk along the green belt all the time. And this year I got the intuition that it was flowering earlier than it normally does. Like it just seemed earlier than the past few years. And I feel like it was sort of correct. So 24 is this green line, and it does seem a little higher than most years, but not significantly higher. The peak of the flowering is still within a week or two of each other from all the past years. But this is only a few years of data. It's going to be really interesting to see what this looks like in another 10 years or so, and people taking photos every year. Because I feel like we might have some warmer springs coming up, and we might see this move forward. Maybe a week or two in the next few years as things warm up in the spring. Let's see. Another really common one are the two common caloportus, the Mariposa lilies we have around Boise. So we have the sagebrush Mariposa lily, which is a bit lower, and then the white Mariposa lily, which is up in the hills. So I've seen them separate. I've never actually seen them grow together or near each other, although I'm sure it happens occasionally. And just looking at this, it seems really cool that they actually have, when they're flowering, and again, just like balsam root, if someone takes a photo of a Mariposa lily, it's definitely in flower. Very few people take photos of just the fruit. So it's really interesting to see they share flowering in time almost exactly. June through July, but elevation-wise, they only share a few hundred feet, and they only overlap a little bit in that way, even though they overlap a lot in time. So it's a really good indicator of the different habitats and the different adaptations that the two species have. Let's see, one more. So one more with phenology, the glacier lily. This is a really nice common species all throughout Idaho. The one insightful thing I learned looking at the phenology of this is everyone in the north, Moscow, Coeur d'Alene, Sandpoint, gets glacier lilies before we do, which is really a little counterintuitive because I've always felt like all of the north has spring later. But if glacier lily is the first sign of spring, they actually get it before we do. We don't have them down in the valley, of course, but they're pretty abundant up on the ridgeline and at Bogus Basin. And also there's a lot of populations around McCall, around West Yellowstone, and around the mountains around Pocatello. But it's almost nearly a month that Moscow, Coeur d'Alene, Sandpoint can see glacier lilies before everyone down south, before everyone McCall south starts seeing them. So I thought that was really neat and unexpected.
How do you explain?
I think those northern sites are a little lower elevation, and they just get warmer a little quicker.
I think there's some the northern and southern might actually be in different varieties at the moment too.
Oh, different varieties. Yeah.
One with the purple anthers and the other with the white anthers, and Bogus Bay. McCall was right where they kind of transition. So it'd be interesting to see if that factors in.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't consider that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move beyond forests. Pine trees. So there's a few hundred observations of each of these common pine trees. So we got ponderosa, western white pine, limber pine, Pinus flexilis, lodgepole pine, and whitebark pine, all throughout Idaho. Looking at the elevation distribution. Oh, by the way, if you've never seen sort of figures like this, think of them as sort of histograms where, for example, with Pinus flexilis, of all the observations, the vast majority are right here, between 5,000 and 6,000 feet. And then, for Pinus monticula, most of the observations are right around 2,500 feet, a little bit over here. So it just means most of them are where it's highest. And it shows the elevation profiles of all of them really well. Like we have ponderosa down where it's low, white bark pine at the highest elevation up on the peaks, and the other ones in between. They overlap a little bit, but it turns out if you dig in a little deeper and say, instead of elevation, let's look at temperature and precipitation, then you start seeing the real differences between them. So the Pinus flexilis, which sort of shares some elevation profiles with lodgepole pine, but really this is an eastern Idaho tree, and it's living on those most dry sites, on around Leadore, around Salmon, those really dry ridge lines is where this thing grows. And then Pinus monticula, which shares seemingly similar habitat as ponderosa, but really it's a northern species, and it's really grown in those wettest sites up in the north. And that makes sense because it's a distrunct. It also grows over in the Cascades where it's really, really wet and lots of precip. So it's growing in those similar habitats in North Idaho. And to be fair, this isn't anything new. Pine trees in Idaho are one of the most studied organisms ever. But it's worth noting that, a figure like this and an analysis like this 50 years ago would have been an entire PhD thesis. It would take a lot of work. I did this on Sunday morning over 2 cups of coffee. So it's really interesting how much technology helps things out in doing these big data analysis. And of course, with the millions of observations on iNaturalist, there's a lot of different species you can sort of dig into to find these trends. So let's take a look at the currents. So these aren't all the ribes in Idaho. These are just the most common and probably the most easily identifiable as well. So we have the box current, swamp current, sticky currents. Golden current is the one we have along the green belt here. Interestingly, they share really similar elevation profiles, which basically matches all of the forested areas from here up to the Canadian border. That's pretty much what these elevation profiles mean. But then when we split it out between the precip and the temperature, we see that what really differentiates them as far as habitat goes is a very subtle precipitation gradient, where a golden current lives in the driest ones, and the swamp current, which I think is up north, it lives in the most wet areas. But it's really subtle, much more subtle than the pine trees. Yes, and think about one more. So strawberries, of the 2 strawberry species we have Fragaria vesca, Fragaria virginiana, there is no difference in their habitat, not in elevation, not with precipitation, not with temperature. They're exactly the same. So it's weird that there are 2 different species, honestly. And yeah, this really surprised me because I thought for sure there would be some sort of difference, but no, they have the exact same range. They're both found everywhere in Idaho. They're really common, and there's really no difference in where they live, though. At least not that I can tell from this type of data. Another interesting thing is I went through all the strawberry observations, around 600 or so, which didn't take as long as it sounds, and I looked at all the ones that had fruit on them, which is a very small amount, only 26 of them, so less than 5% of them had fruit. And I tried to discern some sort of pattern of when or where they fruit, and there is just no pattern that can be found. So these are phenology curves of where the ones that have no fruit are found and where the ones that do have fruit. So all I can say it's around June or July. There's no pattern of like when or where. And so if you're ever out and about and you're sad that you're not finding any strawberry fruit, this happens to me a lot, don't feel bad. I feel like it's completely random when the things fruit out. Yeah. I really wanted to find something with this because I love strawberry fruit, but it's really rare for me to find one. I visited Minnesota once, which they also have a Fragaria species, and it was actually really common to find the actual fruit out and about. Like I was seeing them everywhere. And so my hypothesis, I don't know how to prove this, it's some sort of pollinator limitation. You know,
How about if the critters, we could do it all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
they don't. I'm there first. Yeah. But I guess maybe the birds. Yeah. But yeah, pollinator limitation is more interesting. And something I can't do anything about. Let's see. So I believe, yeah. So that's all I've got about talking about iNaturalist. A few closing points. It's a great platform for looking at submitting your own photos, looking at other people's photos. It's great for keeping track of all my adventures and the cool things that I see. And also something worth noting is iNaturalist as a whole is a nonprofit. They're not a for-profit company. There's no ads on the website and it's completely free to use. And I know there are several other applications or even like most camera apps do automatic identification of plants nowadays, but none of them release their data. Only iNaturalist lets you download all the data, and it's used a ton in research in like academia, and a lot of agencies use it. And so, yeah, you should use iNaturalist instead of those other apps because they actually like give back to, for research that happened for people to actually use all this stuff.
How is it funded?
They get giant grants.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
One of the sources